Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid podcast. Our goal today and every day is to reconstruct religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. Last week we talked with Dr. Carmen Imes, looking at Genesis 1 through 2 and the role of humanity as God's embodied images and royal family members. Now that the all-powerful Creator has set up his children within his good creation, the rest of the human story will be a beautiful narrative of progress toward perfection, right? Right? Sadly, no. Pretty much anyone who knows pretty much anything about the Bible knows about Genesis 3. And that's what we'll cover both this week and next week. I have to split this one into two parts. One covering the conditions leading up to the so-called fall, and one covering the conditions after. And I say so-called fall for a reason. You might remember in the first episode I teased that there were 3 fall narratives in Genesis 1 through 11. This is the first of the 3. Because most of my listeners are Western Protestants, we are used to talking about the fall, courtesy of St. Augustine. He preferred to centralize this Genesis 3 narrative in his description of what went wrong with the world. However, this was not the only position within the early church. Eusebius of Caesarea foregrounded the Babel event of Genesis 11, whereas Irenaeus of Lyon foregrounded the Nephilim event of Genesis 6. The point of all this nerdery is this. I believe we need to see all 3 fall narratives as constitutive of the overall problem, and not zoom in so closely on one that we ignore the bigger picture. I would even argue that this composite 3-fall narrative is the best way to read those 3 church fathers, for what it's worth. In any case, together, the 3 falls of Genesis 1 through 11 paint a picture of humanity and all creation being subjected to the evil powers, death, sin, and demons, respectively. I will unpack in part 2 next week why this one is about death rather than sin, but for now, I want to turn our attention back to the narrative preceding that fall. And immediately, we have a serious problem. There is a serpent in the garden. I prefer serpent rather than snake for 2 reasons. For one, it reflects the Hebrew word sense better, and 2, it sounds more like something out of high medieval fantasy. And being the lover of Lord of the Rings that I am, either you're here for it or you're not. Sorry, not sorry. But, to set the cheekiness aside for a minute, the imagery of dragon or serpent is something that comes up very often in the later portions of the biblical narrative. St. Paul uses the term serpent in 2 Corinthians 11:3 to describe this being, and we see in Revelation 12 a reference to the great dragon, that serpent of old, who is cast out of heaven. This is one of those puzzles of biblical interpretation that gets to be a deep, deep rabbit hole. Who is the serpent in the garden? Satan is the usual suspect. But I'm not convinced that this is what the text is saying. For one thing, this interpretation developed quite late, and it definitely goes beyond what the text says on its own. Alternative suggestions from several semi-canonical books have been the devil, from the Wisdom of Solomon, one of the Watchers, from 1 Enoch, and Azazel, from the Apocalypse of Abraham. The more common view of several secular and/or skeptical scholars has been that this is just a snake. In this view, the rest of the chapter is seen as a fanciful type of Rudyard Kipling story, how the snake lost its legs, why animals don't talk anymore, and why humans and snakes hate each other. I'm being a bit facetious, because I don't find this view very compelling at all, but it is worth being generous in saying that it is possible that the semi-canonical Book of Jubilees, written at the turn of the BC-AD divide, could be read as taking that view. And how we view the identity of this being matters, because this is one of the ways in which people have started to see the God of the Bible a bit differently. Why is the serpent there to test the humans at all? Didn't Adonai know he was there and that it would happen? Was he there on a mission from Adonai, or did he go rogue, so to speak? These are all questions with quite a bit of weight for how we view the God of the Bible and his role in the temptation of Adam and Eve. In fact, I have heard people read Genesis 3 to say that Adonai intentionally put the serpent there, knowing it would cause all the evil we experience in the world today, and did so on purpose in order to demonstrate his glory and to show his power. If you don't believe me, look up the term felix felicis, or fortunate fall. It's not pretty, and having this view of Adonai in mind can really warp your sense of his character. If this is what God does, we might think, then I am just a pawn in the rigged chess match of his own glory. I know that some people will hear this and get frustrated that I'm using a straw man here, but this is absolutely a view which is out there and has been taught in ordinary churches. I also am convinced that it is not what we see happening in Genesis 3. So, let's take a closer look at the serpent. Who or what is it, and why is he or it there? The biggest thing that we discover is that the serpent is cunning, or subtle, or crafty, or shrewd in other versions. This same Hebrew word is used throughout the book of Proverbs to describe someone who is prudent or wise. Now wait just a corn-picking second. Is the serpent the good guy here? Not quite. I believe we are supposed to see the serpent as having wisdom, but misusing it in order to deceive. This lays out a fundamental principle of good and evil that has a lot of impact on how we see the God of the Bible. The early church fathers consistently resisted any presentation of evil as a, quote, thing with its own identity and ontology. Rather, they almost unanimously framed it as a perversion or a privation of good. In case this has too much theological jargon for you, just look at the wisdom of the serpent as an example. The serpent has something good, wisdom, and was created good as one of Adonai's creatures. But as a rational being, he chose to use that good gift to deceive and destroy, rather than fulfill the purpose for which he was created. That picture of the cunning/wisdom of the serpent should look familiar to us humans. We have all been created good, as Genesis 1 told us, and we have all been given a glorious vocation, as Genesis 2 told us. Now it is up to us to decide what to do with those good gifts, to use them for tov, the Hebrew word for good, or ra, the Hebrew word for bad. I will just stick a pin in the discussion of tov and ra for when we talk about the two trees, but for now, let's return to the serpent. The Hebrew word for serpent here is nachash, and that tells us that the serpent is most likely a divine being whose original role was to worship at the throne of Adonai. Now, how in the name of Viggo Mortensen did I get there? Well, ancient Hebrew is a highly pictorial language, which often uses its capacity for nuances and shades of polyvalent meaning to create works of poetry within narrative. That is exactly what we see happening in Genesis 3 with the nachash. The root word of nachash is also used to describe copper, brass, or bronze. It can also be used to form the word for deception. Instead of a literal serpent, it can also be used to convey the meaning of wisdom and enlightenment, leading to an alternative translation used in some Bibles, the Shining One. The overall poetic picture is a divine being, gifted with reason and wisdom, shining with heavenly glory, but using all of those gifts to deceive and destroy. This picture of both humanity and the Nachash shows us something about Adonai's character. He is a giver of good gifts, even when his family members, both divine and human, misuse those gifts. He has given us all that we require to become the fullest expression of what he has intended, the living, breathing, embodied reflections of himself, ruling over creation with his own benevolence and love. And to reflect his own freedom, Adonai has gifted his creation with the dignity of choice. And that is fundamentally what it means when we discover that the garden has a serpent. The Shining One is a rational being, like the humans, who is given a glorious gift, like the humans, and has a choice as to whether they use it as intended or not, like the humans. This isn't a setup on the part of Adonai. He is here giving his royal family members the honor of letting them choose, on their own, without his intervention. And the choice is simple. Whose voice will they listen to? The voice of their Father and Creator, who has been immanent and present with them for as long as they have been living, who has given them the gift of every tree in the garden to eat from, of animals for companionship and support, and a creature like themselves who is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Or will they listen to the voice of this divine serpent being? The serpent seems pleasing to the eyes and seems good for attaining wisdom, and it appears that they speak with Adonai's own voice, or at least they seem to know Adonai's own voice. They reference the Father's own words, but notice how they twist them. In Genesis 2, we heard this from Adonai: "Of every tree in the garden you may freely eat." In Genesis 3, we hear the cunning, shrewd, crafty, shining one's version: "Has God indeed said, 'You shall not eat of every tree in the garden'?" Notice the subtle shift. From Adonai's mouth, there is an open invitation to eat. From the serpent's forked tongue, there is a negative prohibition. And this is precisely what spiritual trauma and religious abuse looks like. In our discussion group last week, I shared a screenshot of a definition I found on X, that is one of the best I have found. Spiritual trauma is someone handing you an inner critic and telling you it's the voice of God. That is essentially what the serpent does here. They cast doubt on the goodness of Adonai. They make the generosity of the Father miserly or capricious, not by telling outright lies, but by taking Adonai's own words and shrewdly, craftily twisting them into their own cunning shape. Lest we think this is a modern take that the ancient readers wouldn't have seen, here is St. John Chrysostom from the 4th century. Quote, "Notice in this case the extreme subtlety of his malice. In the unfolding of his planning and inquiry, he introduces words not spoken by God and acts as though motivated by care for them. It is as if the evil demon were saying, 'Why did he deprive you of such enjoyment? Why does he not allow you to share in the good things in the garden, instead of granting you the pleasure of looking at them, while not permitting you to possess them and thus gain the greater enjoyment? What is the advantage of life in the garden when you aren't free to enjoy the things in it, but are even worse off in incurring the more intense pain of having sight of things, but missing out on the enjoyment that comes from possessing them? Do you see how he uses the words like a bait to inject his poison?'" Do you see how he uses the words like a bait to inject his poison? End quote. That is exactly how many people I have lived and worked with have found their experience of being in the church. There is an extreme subtlety to the malice of spiritual trauma. Words not spoken by God are delivered as if motivated by care for the person. The words of Scripture are used like bait to inject a poison. And then, in perfectly understandable backlash to this subtle malice, people who have been so poisoned by the serpentine use of the words of their Father conclude that he is, in fact, the evil demon. He desires only to deprive them of enjoyment. He only grants the pleasures of looking at good things, but doesn't permit them to possess them. And in this, they are worse off and in more intense pain because they see but cannot touch or taste. I am convinced that simply labeling these people deconstructionists and then writing them off as if they are broadly motivated by ill intent or hedonism or tickling their own ears is fundamentally participating in the malice of the serpent. When we as the church, God with skin on, neither preach nor live out the actual goodness of the actual Father, particularly toward those who have been hurt by our own hands, we are the bait to inject the poison of the serpent. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. And rather than asking for cheap forgiveness here, we need to begin a long repentance. But for now, let's return back to the text. I had made the claim earlier that the actual words of the Father were an open invitation to eat, rather than a negative prohibition. You might have been screaming at your listening device, "What about the tree of knowledge of good and evil?" I promised I would get there, and now, here we are. Yes, it is true that Adonai told them they were not to eat of that particular tree. What gives? Why even put it in the garden at all? Isn't this just cruel torture, to put something that looks good in front of them and then pull a Dennis Nedry? To begin with, I'm going to acknowledge something that you sometimes may not hear very often. The text is not self-evident. It does not explain itself clearly, and those questions are valid, normal, sensible, and can easily be coming from a good heart. So, if these have been your questions, particularly if those questions have not been welcomed in your community of faith, just know you are welcome here, and you are loved. As proof of how normal and self-evident these questions are, This is the very question my then 5-year-old daughter asked me when we encountered this story. Daddy, why did God put the tree there if it wasn't good for them? I will give you all the same response I gave her, only slightly tuned up for more than 5-year-olds. And to put it simply, the tree was there because their father did want them to eat from it, when they were ready to handle it. This may break your brain initially, because I suspect that few of you had that impression, but I myself was surprised to discover that this was the view of the early church fathers. The fullest expression of it comes through Irenaeus of Lyon, a 2nd century Christian. Please read his book Against Heresies if you are interested. And just a tip, might want to start with book 3, not book 1. You'll thank me later. But for space and brevity, here I'll quote Theophilus of Antioch, also from the 2nd century. Quote, "The tree of knowledge itself was good, and its fruit was good. For it was not the tree, as some think, but the disobedience which had death in it. For there was nothing else in the fruit than only knowledge. But knowledge is good when one uses it discreetly. But Adam, being yet immature, was on this account as yet unable to receive knowledge worthily. For now also, when a child is born, it is not at once able to eat bread, but is nourished first with milk, and then, with the increment of years, it advances to solid food. Thus, too, it would have been with Adam. For not as one who grudges him, as some suppose, did God command him not to eat of knowledge." End quote. The analogy I gave to my daughter was similar. I pointed to my truck. I told her that someday I would let her drive it, God willing. But, to quote Aragorn, it is not this day. If I were to let her behind the wheel today, in her immaturity and ignorance, she wouldn't be able to handle it. Not only would it cause damage to her, she would likely cause quite a bit of collateral damage to the world around her as well as to other people. So, in my very much not infinite fatherly wisdom, I tell her that she is not to reach out and take what seems good to her eyes. And, by the way, it remains something that is actually desirable and pleasing. Not only because it is the best truck, Honda Ridgeline, in the best color possible, diffused sky blue, but also because it actually brings good things about. I take her to gymnastics and rock climbing and mountain biking in it. She goes to school and church in it. We go to visit family in it, etc. The truck/tree is a good thing, when used properly, when given proper respect and distance, when she is ready. And this process of maturity and being ready isn't just a hurry up and wait thing. She's already asked me 10,000 questions about its inner workings, some of which I must plead ignorance to. She is learning how to use it, by partaking of it, not by driving it, but by sitting inside it and asking her father about why and how it does what it does. And that precise picture is why the tree of knowing is in the garden. But you've probably heard it called the tree of knowledge and good and evil before, right? I have seen this sometimes set up in ways that cause harm. They were innocent children who didn't know. Why did God punish them for eating from it? I will address that question in more depth in the second half of Genesis 3, when we look at the consequences of this particular fall narrative. But for now, I want to just shift our thinking a bit on the Hebrew words which have been translated good and evil, tov and ra. The first one is tov, and good is a perfectly serviceable translation. But it means so much more than just okay. It means something closer to be well, or to be beautiful. It is not quite as all-encompassing as shalom, but it is close in tone. It is the word Adonai uses throughout the creation narratives we just discussed last few chapters. It means that things are as they should be. All is well. The tree of knowing helps the humans understand how things should be, tov. But the opposite is also worth knowing, ra. This does not mean evil with the weight the English word usually carries. It means not good or bad. It means things are not as they should be, things functioning outside of their creational pattern and design. And that helps us understand why Adonai tells his royal family members not to eat of it, because they are in the garden where all is tov, and to introduce ra into that state of wellness has to be handled with delicacy and care. I think that if we consider it, any parent has had that experience. We sometimes try to explain a very difficult and troublesome idea to a child in the abstract before they encounter it out in the real world, maybe homelessness or abuse or death. And there's a sense that the kid sort of gets it, but they don't really get it until they have experienced it, either by witnessing it, seeing its effects, or, God forbid, even firsthand. Then they come back to the parents with questions about Tov and Ra. What does this mean? Why are things like this? What can be done about it? That is what the tree of knowing is all about, and that connects to the Hebrew word for knowing here as well, yada. This is the same root word used in the next chapter when Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived a child from that knowing. This is not just knowing about any more than Genesis 4 is trying to tell us that Adam learned the truth value of a set of propositions about his wife, and a child came out of it. This is an incredibly intimate, literally, and participatory word. Adonai yada what Ra is like, because he made everything Tov. He understands that his children will eventually yada this for themselves, but he wants them to experience it in a certain way, under his wing, with his protection and support and wisdom to guide them through this possibly painful process of yada. So he makes a way for this knowing to happen safely, and he will gladly and freely share that knowledge with them when they are ready. And that picture of the God of the Bible is something that many people never encounter. They may be told that God was setting up a test for his children to see if they pass or not, or that he is just building up to a purposeful and intentional fall only so that he can receive greater glory. Many people have seen this picture of Adonai and concur with the serpent. He is holding out on me. He is depriving me of pleasures. He is torturing me by holding something in front of me that I can't have. I have absolutely zero desire to demonize or denigrate anyone who has deconstructed for those reasons, because, frankly, the God they reject is also one I reject. The good news, as I see it, is that there is a more Tov picture of Adonai in Genesis 3, a father who wants to give good gifts, but in the way that will serve his children best. The greatest gift the Father gives is the second named tree, the tree of life. But don't Christians teach that the soul is immortal and that Adam and Eve were created immortal? Not quite. Theophilus of Antioch again. For man had been made in middle nature, neither wholly mortal, nor altogether immortal, but capable of either. I can understand why this might seem like nonsense. Could humanity die or not? But we have to understand the term mortality as the ancient Near East did. They saw mortality just as they saw immortality, a quality that is part of the nature of the being. One might even say that in both cases, mortality and immortality, the being was, quote, subject to that nature. We see this even in Greek pagan thought. A man can no more choose to live forever than a god can choose to die. Both are bound by the conditions of their nature. There is an example of this in Tolkien's Legendarium, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. There, elves are not subject to death in the same way as men are. For them, there is no such thing as, quote, dying of natural causes. This is contrasted with the Valar and Maiar, Tolkien's pantheon of gods, essentially, who literally cannot die. That is why Sauron keeps coming back in multiple incarnations. His spirit endures regardless of the destruction of his physical forms. It would be more or less correct to think of humanity in the garden as being like the elves in Tolkien's Arda. They can die, but they are not subject to it. However, they are not wholly independently existing, and thus they must eventually return to their source of life, Valinor. It blurs the lines between mortality and immortality, and it is no accident that Tolkien himself was a committed Catholic for whom church fathers like Theophilus were considered to be saints. He knew his Bible, and he knew his tradition. So in Genesis, we don't see a self-sustaining immortal humanity, or else what is the need for the tree of life? Nor do we see a mortal humanity subject to death because of the goodness of creation. So, what do we see? A humanity that has the capability or capacity for death, but which must continually eat from the source of their life, the tree of life. And what is the tree of life? Nothing less than eternal life itself, Zoe Ionios in Greek, the very life of Adonai. St. Paul in 1 Timothy tells us that Adonai alone is immortal. The images of God are not immortal, but neither are they, at this point in the story, mortal. they are invited to freely partake of the life of Adonai, to become as he is more and more as they participate in his divine nature more and more. Of course, there is an ontological ceiling here. Humans, either in the garden or outside of it, can never be the God above the gods. These are the Hebrew and Christian scriptures after all, not the Mormon ones. But throughout our scriptures, we see the same thing. Humanity is designed to grow into their inheritance as small g gods. The author of Hebrews quotes Psalms when it says of Adonai, "You made humanity a little lower than the angels, and crowned him with glory and honor." 2:7, see also 8:5. St. Paul in his epistle to the Romans says that, "To those who by perseverance in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, Adonai will give eternal life." 2:7, see also 6:23. Psalm 82 pictures Adonai in his throne room in the midst of his divine council, and he declares to the divine beings, "You are gods, you are all sons of the Most High." Verse 6. Jesus quotes that passage to the Pharisees to defend his claim to be the Son of God. Not just another angel among many, but the angel of the Lord, a figure throughout the Hebrew Scriptures who is both distinct from Adonai and also acts as Adonai. This is prophesied in Zechariah, where he declares that when Adonai visits his people again after their exile, the house of David will be like Adonai, like the angel of the Lord going before them. 12:8. Humanity, through Israel, God's chosen people, are designed to be like Adonai and also like the angel of the Lord, i.e., Christ, which is functionally saying the same thing. And finally, we see St. Peter, who tells us that humanity has been given exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature. 2 Peter 1:4. The promise of all of these scriptures is that humanity was made to participate in the divine life, and that we were made like the sons of God, the divine beings, but a little lower, and designed to grow into maturity and be elevated even higher than these lowercase gods. And the way that this elevation would happen is through the Son of God himself, the second person of the Trinity, the eternal Logos, taking up human nature into himself and uniting it with Adonai's own nature, until the house of David is like God, eating from the tree of Adonai's own Zoe Ionios. And that is precisely the image we see in Genesis 2-3, before they eat of the tree of knowing. Humanity is formed by Adonai's own hands and as his image, but it is immature. That is what knowledge of Tov and Ra means everywhere else we find that phrase in the scriptures. It describes a child who hasn't yet reached maturity. Humanity in the garden is clothed in glory, but it is not yet fully glorious. That will happen when it partakes ever more fully in the divine life, by eating of the tree of life. And that tree of life, we find out later, is Christ himself, the exact image of the invisible God, come to take on flesh and blood as a human, in order that we might become sons and daughters of the Most High. The Eastern Orthodox tradition has a word for this, theosis. And in a word, that is the story of the entire scriptures, how the Selam Nefesh dirt creatures of Genesis are to become partakers of the divine nature. But of course, this is dependent upon them actually participating in the life of Adonai, their father. And sadly, we discover right away that they do not. The results are, well, in a word, catastrophic. But that will have to wait for next time. So, explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay? Ready? God showed his children 2 good trees. The tree of knowing they had to wait to eat from, but the tree of his own life they could freely eat from. All they had to do was trust their father. But the serpent whispered that they should take their inheritance before they were ready. I hope this walkthrough of the early portion of Genesis 3 has helped you see how the God of the Bible didn't create the temptation of the garden as a setup or a cruel taunt. The Hebrew Scriptures present the tree of knowing as something that will be eaten from in time. They establish a pattern for the voice of the serpent that twists Adonai's words to bring death instead of life. They show in the Shining One how Adonai gives good gifts even when they are misused by his creatures. And they loudly proclaim that the biggest of those gifts is for humanity to grow into maturity and become like Adonai himself, eating from the tree of his own divine life. My prayer is that this picture of Genesis 3 has helped reconstruct a picture of God and religion which doesn't hurt either your heart or your head. I always welcome feedback, so please feel free to comment on our Facebook group if you have some thoughts on the content of today's episode. You'll find a link to that in the show notes and on our Podbean HQ. So now, my offer to you is to get out there and choose life. What are the ways that you can exercise trust in your loving Father, who longs to give good gifts when he says, not yet, or not in this way? How can you grow into maturity, not just chronologically, but to reflect his goodness more and more until you look like Christ? What are the voices of the serpent in your own life, which twist the voice of God into something that kills part of your soul? How can you reject those voices of death by focusing on the heart of your Father and listening for his voice? And finally, how would it change things for you if you truly believe that your rightful inheritance is to enter into the divine counsel of the Most High God? How would you treat your body differently? How would you treat your fellow royal family members differently? Would it make it easier to wait to taste and see of some fruit if you remembered that this is the fruit God is offering you? I will leave you with that challenge and look forward to hearing how you all decide to do that this week. On YouTube and X, you can find me at ChurchKidPod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean, so you can find the HQ for all podcast content on churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started to get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give me any respect. And without those sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback to improve where I can. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.